The living room had gone completely silent by the time my sister finished talking, the particular silence of a family that has just heard something that rearranges everything they thought they understood about a situation. "He came on to me," Danielle said, her voice carrying the specific, practiced vulnerability of someone who has rehearsed this sentence enough times to deliver it with precisely the right combination of reluctance and wounded dignity. "I didn't want to say anything because I knew how much it would hurt you. But I can't keep watching you plan a wedding with someone who did that to me." My fiancé, James, was sitting beside me on the sofa, and I felt rather than saw the particular stillness that settled over him, the stillness of someone absorbing an accusation so far from anything they recognize as their own reality that their first response is simply the inability to process it as real. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My father was looking at Danielle with an expression I couldn't quite read. My aunt, who had been visiting for the weekend and had therefore become an involuntary audience for a confrontation that none of us had anticipated happening on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, was staring at the carpet. "Danielle," I said, my voice carrying a calm that I genuinely did not feel, "what are you talking about?" "At Emma's birthday dinner last month," Danielle said, her eyes filling with tears that arrived with impressive promptness. "He found me in the hallway when I was coming back from the bathroom. He said things. He touched my arm. He said he sometimes wondered what it would be like if he'd met me first." James said, "That didn't happen." "I'm not lying," Danielle said, her voice sharpening slightly. "I know you believe that," James said, with the particular measured quality of someone choosing words extremely carefully, "but I'm telling you, with complete certainty, that conversation did not happen. I was at Emma's birthday dinner for 2 hours. I was with your sister the entire time except when I went to the bar to get our drinks, and that took approximately 4 minutes. It happened in the hallway," Danielle said. "You know it did." "It didn't," James said. "I want to tell you that in that moment, I believed my fiancé completely and without question. But I want to be honest, because I think honesty matters in a story like this, and the honest version is more complicated. What I felt, in that living room on that Sunday afternoon, was not certainty. What I felt was a particular, nauseating confusion, the specific cognitive dissonance of hearing two completely contradictory accounts from two people I loved, delivered with equal apparent conviction, in a situation where I had no direct evidence to resolve the contradiction. I had been with James for 3 years. I knew him as someone careful with words, genuinely kind, entirely uninterested in the kind of behavior Danielle was describing. He had never given me any reason to doubt his faithfulness or his character in any of the ways that mattered. I also knew Danielle. This is where I need to take you back, because understanding why that living room scene was as complicated as it was requires understanding who my sister actually is, not in the dismissive, convenient way that people sometimes characterize a person they've decided to villainize in retrospect, but in the specific, honest, difficult way of someone who has loved a complicated person for their entire life and watched that complication cause damage repeatedly. My name is Claire. Danielle is my older sister by 4 years, and our relationship has always been characterized by a dynamic that I think people who haven't lived it sometimes struggle to fully believe because it sounds, described plainly, almost cartoonishly straightforward. Danielle wanted what I had. Not everything I had, and not always. She had periods of genuine warmth toward me, genuine celebration of my achievements, genuine sisterly affection that made the other periods more confusing rather than less. But consistently, throughout our lives, there existed a pattern in which things that were specifically mine, possessions, friendships, opportunities, achievements, became things Danielle found herself drawn toward in ways that went beyond ordinary sibling interest into something more specifically acquisitive. This had started in childhood, in ways that individually felt trivial but that, assembled across decades, formed a pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Friends I made who subsequently became closer to Danielle than to me, through a process of dedicated, charming attention that I watched happen several times before I learned to recognize it early enough to brace for. Opportunities one earned that Danielle would subsequently pursue herself, not always achieving them but always attempting, in ways that felt less like her own ambition finding parallel expression and more like direct response to my specific success. By the time I was in my 20s, I had developed a careful, somewhat wary relationship with sharing good news with Danielle before I was certain it was secure, having learned from experience that announcements of things I was excited about occasionally had the effect of generating Danielle's interest in those exact things in ways that felt uncomfortable to fully articulate. The first time this dynamic intersected directly with a romantic relationship was when I was 24, and I introduced my then boyfriend, a man named Patrick, at a family Christmas gathering. Danielle and Patrick subsequently developed what she described as a friendship through social media that evolved over the following 6 months into something I only fully understood when Patrick told me, during a breakup conversation about 8 months after that Christmas, that he had feelings for someone else, who, it eventually became apparent, was Danielle. I want to be fair about this. Patrick's choices were his own, and whatever Danielle's role in cultivating that connection, she hadn't forced anything on anyone. The relationship between Patrick and Danielle lasted approximately 4 months before dissolving, which Danielle mentioned to me with genuine seeming remorse while suggesting that what had happened was evidence that Patrick had never been right for me anyway. I tell you this not to establish Danielle as a simple villain in a simple story, but because it is directly relevant to understanding why that Sunday afternoon living room scene was as genuinely complicated as it was, why the question of who to believe was not as straightforward as I sometimes wish it had been. I had history with Danielle and romantic partners. I also had 3 years of genuine, accumulated experience with James's character. These two things sat beside each other in my chest that Sunday afternoon and refused to neatly resolve. James had proposed 6 months earlier, on a hiking trip we'd taken to celebrate our 3-year anniversary, in a moment that felt, entirely genuinely, like exactly the right question asked at exactly the right time. I had said yes with the particular happiness of someone who has arrived somewhere they've been moving toward for a long time without quite realizing how fully they were oriented in that direction. The engagement had been met with general family celebration, including from Danielle, who had hugged me at our engagement party with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm and told James he was exactly what Claire deserves, in a tone that felt, at the time, like real sisterly warmth. I had allowed myself, in the months since that engagement party, to believe that this was a chapter of our relationship in which Danielle and I might be arriving somewhere more settled, more genuinely mutual, more free from the particular competitive undercurrent that had characterized so much of our shared history. Emma's birthday dinner, the event Danielle was now citing as the location of her alleged encounter with James, had been an ordinary occasion, my cousin Emma's 30th birthday, a dinner at a restaurant that about 12 family members had attended, a pleasant evening that I remembered clearly because James and I had stayed afterward for drinks with Emma and her husband and I'd gotten home later than intended and hadn't slept well. I had no memory of James being out of my sight long enough for the encounter Danielle was describing. But memory is an imperfect instrument, and I was aware of this, and aware that the awareness itself wasn't evidence of anything except my own reasonable epistemic humility. Why didn't you tell me immediately? I asked Danielle, because this felt like the question I was allowed to ask without either endorsing or dismissing her account. I was scared, she said. I knew you'd choose him. I knew you'd think I was making it up. Are you making it up? I asked. Claire, my mother said, in a tone of gentle reproach. No, Danielle said, her voice carrying a hurt that looked genuine. I'm not. And I know that's what you all think, and I know I can't prove it, but I'm telling you the truth and I need you to believe your own sister over someone you've known for 3 years. The room redistributed itself, in the way that rooms do during difficult family confrontations, into positions that communicated allegiance without explicit declaration. My mother sat beside Danielle. My father remained standing, his expression still unreadable. My aunt had found something interesting to examine in her handbag. James sat beside me, very still, and said nothing more, having apparently made the correct assessment that additional protestations of innocence would produce no useful result in this particular moment. And then my brother Daniel, who had been sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room throughout this entire confrontation and who had said nothing at all for the 15 minutes it had been unfolding, stood up. "I need to show everyone something," he said. His voice carried a quality I hadn't heard in it before, something between reluctance and resolution, the specific tone of someone who has been holding something for longer than was comfortable and has finally decided the holding is no longer the right choice. "Daniel," my mother said, with the particular warning note mothers use when they sense that whatever comes next is going to be more complicated than they want it to be. "I know," Daniel said. "I've been sitting with this for 3 weeks and I don't think I can sit with it anymore." He took out his phone. "I need to tell you about the 6 months between my engagement and that Sunday afternoon, because the specific texture of those months matters for understanding why Daniel sitting on a video for 3 weeks was both surprising and, on reflection, entirely comprehensible. The engagement party had been held at my parents' house, 6 months before that confrontation, on a Saturday evening in early spring with approximately 40 guests, fairy lights strung in the garden, and the particular atmosphere of a celebration that everyone present genuinely wanted to be happy about, even though family gatherings always contain their own complicated undertow of history and relationship dynamics that no amount of fairy lights entirely neutralizes. Danielle had been present, as I've mentioned, and her behavior that evening had been the specific version of Danielle's behavior that I had learned, over decades, to watch most carefully: warm, charming, slightly more attentive to James than might have been strictly necessary, in ways that each individually seemed entirely explainable and collectively produced a low-grade unease that I consistently told myself I was generating from my own history rather than from anything genuinely observable. In the present, James, for his part, had noticed none of this. This was, I had come to understand over 3 years together, partly a function of his specific character. James was genuinely oblivious to certain social dynamics that I found obvious, not from any deficiency of intelligence but simply from a different orientation toward reading rooms and the people in them, and partly a function of his fundamental disinterest in the particular game Danielle was playing, whatever that game actually was. This disinterest, I want to note, was itself a kind of evidence that I had been accumulating throughout the engagement period, though I was careful not to over-rely on it given my awareness of my own potential bias. Danielle had texted James 3 times in the weeks following the engagement party. I knew this because James showed me the text himself, without prompting, after the second one arrived, demonstrating the specific transparency of someone who has nothing to hide and has also correctly assessed that the situation might benefit from proactive disclosure. The texts were, individually, entirely benign. A link to a restaurant she thought we'd both enjoy. A comment on a photo James had posted on social media. A brief message asking for gift advice for our mother's birthday, a request that seemed slightly odd given that Daniel and I were considerably closer to my mother and would have been the more natural people to consult. "This feels like a pattern," I told James, after the 3rd text, showing him what I mean by explaining the Patrick situation and several other historical examples that I won't fully recount here because the point is the pattern rather than each individual instance. "I think you might be right," James said, which was, I realized, an imperfect response. I had wanted him to tell me I was wrong, that I was projecting, that my history with Danielle was making me see things that weren't there. His agreement, while honest and probably accurate, left me with the particular loneliness of being right about something you wished you were wrong about. "Don't encourage it," I said. "I haven't been encouraging it," he said. "I've been responding normally to texts from my fiancé's sister." "I know," I said. "I'm asking you to be slightly less normal about it. Be a little boring. A little unavailable. Not rude. Just not a person who seems worth texting." James, to his credit, understood what I was asking and adjusted accordingly, his responses to subsequent texts becoming shorter, less engaged, more functionally informative and less conversationally interesting. Danielle's text slowed and then stopped, which I took as confirmation of the hypothesis rather than its refutation. This was the background against which Emma's birthday dinner had occurred. The dinner itself was, as I said, a pleasant evening at a restaurant, the kind of Italian place that does everything competently without doing anything memorably, the sort of location chosen for its practical virtues of space and parking rather than its ambience. 12 family members, 3 tables pushed together, the particular mixture of conversations that happen when you bring together people who share history but inhabit different parts of each other's daily lives. Danielle had been present. James and I had sat toward one end of the combined table, with Emma and her husband beside us. Danielle had been positioned toward the other end, between our Aunt Margaret and our cousin from our mother's side, a seating arrangement that had emerged organically from arrival timing rather than any deliberate planning. During the dinner itself, I had not observed any significant interaction between Danielle and James. They had exchanged the ordinary pleasantries of people who are peripherally connected through someone else, a brief conversation about a television show they'd apparently both been watching, a comment Danielle made about James's work that he responded to politely, nothing that registered as unusual in either direction. What I knew about the after-dinner period was this: at some point during the dessert course, I had become absorbed in a conversation with Emma about her plans for the following year, a conversation I'd been genuinely interested in and that had apparently extended longer than I realized. James had gone to the bar to get us both drinks, a task that I estimated had taken somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes based on my vague awareness of him leaving and returning. Danielle had, at some point during this same period, gone to use the bathroom, which was located at the back of the restaurant past the bar. This was the geographical overlap that Danielle was now claiming had produced an encounter in the hallway between the bar and the bathrooms, an encounter I had no direct knowledge of because I'd been talking to Emma. Here is what I knew. From my own direct experience of the evening, James had returned from the bar with our drinks at some point during my conversation with Emma. He had sat back down beside me without particular ceremony, handed me my drink, and joined the conversation for the remainder of the evening. He had not seemed altered by whatever had transpired during the time he was away from the table. He had not seemed guilty, or flustered, or in any way behaving like someone who had just done something he was aware was wrong. I also knew that James was not a good actor in the theatrical sense, which was to say that he was a poor liar, visibly uncomfortable with deception in ways I had observed during the 3 years of our relationship on the rare occasions when he tried to conceal something small, a surprise party he was planning, a gift he'd already bought. He wasn't capable of returning from a hallway encounter of the kind Danielle was describing and sitting back down beside me and behaving normally. These were the things I knew from my own direct experience. What I didn't know, and what produced the specific confusion and pain of that Sunday afternoon and the days that followed, was how to reconcile my own knowledge with the specific, detailed account Danielle was providing, including details that seemed oddly specific for fabrication, the precise words she claimed James had used, the particular gesture she described, the way she said he'd looked at her before speaking. Specific details, I was aware, were not proof of truth. Specific details could be constructed. But they were also the kind of thing that made a dismissive response feel inadequate, made the simple certainty of she's lying harder to fully inhabit. The days following that Sunday confrontation were, without question, the most painful of our engagement period, more painful even than the confrontation itself, because the confrontation had the particular clarity of a crisis that demands immediate response, while the days after it had the formless, grinding quality of unresolved uncertainty. My mother called me the morning after, her voice carrying the particular careful tone of someone trying to manage competing loyalties without fully committing to any of them. "I'm not saying James did anything," she said. "I'm just saying that Danielle is your sister, and she's not someone who would make something like this up without reason." "She has reason," I said. "She's always had reason. You know what happened with Patrick." "That was different," my mother said, in the tone people use when they want to end a comparison without actually engaging with it. "How was it different?" "Claire, I'm not taking sides. I'm asking you to keep an open mind." This conversation, and several similar versions of it with other family members in the days that followed, produced in me a specific kind of exhaustion that I think anyone who has been asked to maintain neutrality in a situation where neutrality felt like its own kind of position will recognize. Keeping an open mind, in this context, meant giving equal weight to two accounts that I privately believed were not equally credible, out of deference to a family loyalty that was being deployed as a kind of moral lever. Daniel said nothing during this entire period. He attended the Sunday confrontation, and he had stood up at the end of it and said he needed to show everyone something, and then my mother had made a comment and the moment had somehow passed and dissolved, and Daniel had put his phone back in his pocket, and we had all dispersed from that living room without the revelation he'd apparently been on the verge of making. I had asked him, that same evening, what he'd been about to show us. "Let me think about it," he said. "Daniel," I said, "if you have something relevant, now is when I need it." "I know," he said. "Give me a few days." 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which I existed in the suspended, grinding uncertainty of not knowing, during which James and I had conversations that were more careful than our conversations had ever previously needed to be, during which my relationship with my mother became slightly more formal and slightly more painful, during which I dreamed, on 2 separate occasions, about the hallway at the back of that Italian restaurant. And then Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "I need you to come over. Bring James. And maybe call your parents." His voice carried that same quality I'd heard at the end of the Sunday confrontation, reluctance and resolution in equal measure, the sound of someone who has finally decided that the weight of what they're carrying is no longer justified by whatever had been making them carry it in silence. We arrived at Daniel's apartment on that Tuesday evening, James and I together, my parents separately, my mother having agreed to come with the careful neutrality of someone who believed she was simply witnessing rather than participating in whatever was about to happen. Danielle was not there. Daniel had specifically not invited her, a decision I understood immediately and that my mother questioned the moment she walked through the door. "Shouldn't Danielle be here for whatever this is?" my mother asked. "No," Daniel said, with a simplicity that closed the question more effectively than any longer explanation would have. He had his laptop open on the coffee table, which was unusual for Daniel, who conducted his digital life almost entirely on his phone and used his laptop primarily for work that required a larger screen. The laptop being open and centered on the coffee table communicated, without words, that whatever he was about to share required a screen rather than simply being described. We arranged ourselves around the coffee table with the slightly formal awkwardness of people who understand that what comes next is significant but don't yet know its shape. My father sat in the armchair. My mother sat on the smaller sofa. James and I sat together on the larger one, close enough that our arms were touching, a contact that felt, in that moment, more important than it might have on an ordinary evening. Daniel remained standing, which I recognized as his particular way of managing his own anxiety. He had always processed difficult things better while moving or at least upright, a habit I'd observed throughout our shared childhood. "I need to explain something before I show you this," he said, "because the explanation matters for understanding why I waited." My mother looked like she wanted to say something but didn't. "At Emma's birthday dinner," Daniel said, "I was sitting near the back of the restaurant for most of the evening, at the end of our tables closest to the bar area. I had a clear sight line to the corridor that leads back to the bathrooms. I wasn't watching it deliberately. I was just positioned in a way that meant I could see it." He paused, in the specific way people pause when they're choosing exactly how to describe something they've thought about describing many times. Danielle got up to use the bathroom about 40 minutes into the dinner. I noticed because she walked past me. About 2 minutes later, James went to the bar. He looked at James briefly, then back at the room generally. What happened next took maybe 3 minutes total. I saw it. And because I'm someone who documents things, you all know this about me, it's just how I am. I had my phone out already because I'd been taking photos of the table for Emma's birthday, and I just kept recording. "What did you record?" my father asked. It was the first time he'd spoken since arriving, and his voice carried the particular weight of someone who has been doing serious thinking for 3 weeks. "I recorded Danielle following James into the corridor," Daniel said. "I recorded her stopping him. I recorded the conversation." The room processed this in silence. Does it have audio? James asked, his voice carrying careful neutrality. Yes, Daniel said. The restaurant was loud enough that it took some work to make out everything clearly, but yes. Most of it is audible. Why did you wait 3 weeks? My mother asked, and her voice carried something more complicated than simple accusation, a genuine question about her son's reasoning, asked by someone who was beginning to understand that the answer would require her to revise something she'd been telling herself. Daniel sat down now, on the arm of the chair nearest the coffee table, and looked at his hands for a moment before answering. Because Danielle is my sister, he said. Because showing this felt like a line I couldn't uncross. Because I kept hoping she would tell the truth on her own, that she would come forward and say she'd made a mistake, and I wouldn't have to be the person who did this to her. I gave her 3 weeks to do that. She didn't. He looked at me when he said this last part, and I understood, in the specific way you understand things about the people you've grown up alongside, that this explanation was also partly for me, an acknowledgement that he had spent 3 weeks watching me exist in painful uncertainty that he had the power to resolve and had chosen, for reasons he genuinely believed were good ones, not to resolve it immediately. I'm sorry I waited, he said, to me specifically. Show us, I said. He turned the laptop to face the room and pressed play. I want to describe what was in that video carefully, because I think the specific content matters and because I am aware that describing it requires me to be honest about things that are still, even now, painful to fully articulate. The video was 47 seconds long. The footage showed the corridor beside the bar area at the back of the restaurant, shot from Daniel's table at an angle that captured the corridor clearly, if not with perfect resolution. The audio was imperfect, carrying the ambient noise of a busy restaurant, but clear enough for voices to be distinguishable once you knew to listen for them. In the first 8 seconds of the video, James walked into the corridor toward the bar. In the second 8 seconds, Danielle followed him. What the video showed next was Danielle touching James's arm to stop him, a gesture that James's body language responded to with visible surprise. He turned, stepped back slightly, the particular physical language of someone who was not expecting contact from this direction. What the audio captured, imperfectly but audibly, was Danielle speaking first. She said, with the practiced lightness of someone delivering a line they've considered in advance, "You know, you could have been with me, if things had been different. I think about that sometimes." James's response was visible before it was audible, the particular stillness of someone processing something unexpected, followed by a posture shift that communicated, even on the imperfect video footage, something between discomfort and resolve. His response, when it came, was audible despite the restaurant noise. "Danielle, I'm going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. I'm going with Claire. That's not something that's ever going to change." He walked away from her toward the bar. The video ended with 14 seconds of Danielle standing alone in the corridor, her expression, and this was visible even on the imperfect footage, even at that angle, shifting through something that looked like embarrassment, then something that looked like calculation, then something that I recognized with a cold clarity that settled in my chest like a stone. She had made a decision, standing in that corridor, that she was going to turn what had just happened into something else entirely. The video ended. The room was completely silent for what felt like a very long time, the particular silence of people separately processing something that requires individual revision of previously held positions before collective response becomes possible. My father spoke first. "Play it again," he said quietly. Daniel played it again. My mother, during the second viewing, pressed her hand to her mouth in a gesture I recognized from the original confrontation, but carrying a completely different weight this time, not the weight of someone receiving shocking information about my fiancé, but the weight of someone understanding, in real time, the full scope of what her daughter had done and what she herself had been an instrument of. She followed him, my father said, when the video ended the second time. It was less a statement than a man hearing himself articulate something he was still processing. She followed him. "Yes," Daniel said. And he walked away. "Clearly and immediately," Daniel said. James was sitting very still beside me, and I realized, turning to look at him, that he was doing the particular thing he did when he was managing strong feeling, the controlled stillness, the careful breathing, the deliberate choosing not to speak until he was certain he could speak without the feeling overwhelming the words. "James," I said. He looked at me, and what I saw in his expression was not triumph, not vindication exactly, but something closer to grief, the specific grief of someone who has spent 3 weeks being not believed by people whose belief matters, and who is now watching that not believing be publicly corrected in a way that changes nothing about the 3 weeks it took. "I know," I said, because I didn't have better words immediately, and "I know" contained most of what I needed to say. My mother stood up, then sat back down, then stood up again, the physical expression of someone whose body is responding to emotional processing that hasn't yet found its direction. "I need to call Danielle," she said. "Mom," Daniel said, "I think maybe we should talk first about what we actually want to happen next, before anyone calls anyone." "She's my daughter," my mother said. "So is Claire," Daniel said, with a gentleness that made the observation more devastating rather than less. My mother sat back down. What followed was a conversation that I found difficult in a way I hadn't anticipated, because I had spent 3 weeks preparing myself for the vindication that Daniel's video provided and had not sufficiently prepared myself for what vindication actually felt like when it arrived. What it felt like was not relief exactly, or not only relief. It felt like the specific sadness of watching a family rearrange itself around a truth it had been avoiding, the specific grief of understanding that something that was already broken had simply been officially confirmed as broken rather than being repaired. My father made the call to Danielle. I wasn't in the room for that conversation. I had gone to Daniel's kitchen with James, partly to give my parents privacy for whatever that call required and partly because James and I needed our own space to begin the process of acknowledging, between just the two of us, what 3 weeks of impossible position had done and what we needed from each other going forward. "I should have pushed harder from the beginning," I told him. "I should have believed you completely without needing the video." "You were being fair," he said. "You were trying to be fair to everyone." Being fair to everyone when one person is lying is just a slower way of being unfair to the person telling the truth, I said. He didn't argue with this, which was the right response. Danielle arrived at Daniel's apartment 40 minutes after my father's phone call, and I want to be honest that the conversation that happened when she walked through the door was not the dramatic, explosive confrontation that stories like this sometimes describe. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more painful precisely because of its quietness. She walked in and saw the laptop, and she understood immediately, from the laptop alone, what had happened. "Daniel showed you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel said. She looked at me. "Claire," she said. "Don't," I said. Not angrily, or not only angrily, with a genuine exhaustion that went deeper than anger, the specific tiredness of someone who has been bracing for something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the other side of it. "I wasn't trying to." "Danielle," my father said, and the single word, delivered in a tone I hadn't heard from him since we were children, stopped her mid-sentence. She stood in the center of Daniel's living room, my sister of 29 years, and for the first time in any conflict I could remember between us, she had absolutely nothing to say that anyone in the room was willing to receive. The silence that followed my father's single-word intervention lasted perhaps 30 seconds, which is a remarkably long time for a room full of people to remain completely without speech. Danielle broke it, finally, not with an apology, not yet, and perhaps not in the way any of us might have hoped for, but with the specific kind of partial acknowledgement that represents the first, insufficient step towards something more complete. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said. I want to be precise about what she meant by this, because I think the specific meaning matters. She did not mean, by this sentence, that she hadn't intended to make the accusation. She meant that she hadn't anticipated the accusation being disproven, that she hadn't accounted for the existence of a recording, that the trajectory she'd set in motion in that restaurant corridor had traveled further and with more consequence than she had apparently modeled when she made her decision to transform rejection into allegation. "What did you think would happen?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than accusation, the specific tone of someone trying to understand a reasoning process that had produced results he found genuinely incomprehensible. Danielle didn't answer this question directly, which told me more than any answer she might have given. I think, my father said, from his armchair, that we need to understand something clearly. You told everyone that James made advances toward you. You told his fiancé. You told your mother. You put your sister through 3 weeks of something that the video shows was entirely the reverse of what you described. I need to understand whether you understand how serious that is. I know it's serious, Danielle said. I don't think you do, my father said. I think you understood it was serious as a strategy. I don't think you fully understood it as a wrong. This distinction, between understanding seriousness as a tactical calculation versus understanding wrongness as a moral reality, was, I thought, the most precise thing my father had said in the entire course of this situation, and watching Danielle receive it was complicated, because I could see her processing it, and the processing looked genuine rather than performed, and genuine processing of a genuine wrong, even in a person who has done something genuinely harmful, produces an expression. That's difficult to watch with pure anger rather than some admixture of grief. I want to tell you that I felt pure anger in those moments, because it would be a simpler and perhaps more satisfying account. But the honest version is that I felt something considerably more complicated, anger and grief and the specific exhaustion of loving someone difficult for your entire life and arriving at a moment that might be the end of a version of that relationship you'd been maintaining through sustained, effortful hope. My mother said very little during this conversation, which was itself a kind of statement. She had spent 3 weeks in a position that the video had now comprehensively reassigned, having been a voice urging me toward open-minded consideration of Danielle's account, having been someone who deployed the language of sisterly loyalty as a moral argument. She was now absorbing the understanding that her deployment of that argument had served Danielle's manipulation rather than any genuine pursuit of truth, and she was doing this absorption quietly, in the particular way my mother processed difficult realizations, internally first, externally later, and never entirely completely. She apologized to James before leaving Daniel's apartment that evening, and the apology was genuine and brief and slightly formal in the way that apologies are when the person offering them is still in the middle of understanding the full scope of what they're apologizing for. I should have been clearer about what I believed, she said. I'm sorry. James accepted this with the grace I had come to expect from him in difficult situations and with the specific generosity of someone who understood that accepting imperfect apologies from people genuinely trying to offer them was more useful than requiring perfection before forgiveness becomes available. My father's apology to James, offered a few days later in a separate conversation, was longer and more specific and went further toward acknowledging the active dimension of his previous neutrality, the ways in which performing balance in a situation with a clear truth and a clear lie had functioned, in practice, as a kind of support for the lie. These apologies mattered to me, I want to say, in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated they would. I had spent 3 weeks feeling unsupported and alone in a way that the video had now vindicated, and the vindication was genuinely important, but the apologies carried a different kind of weight, the acknowledgement not just that the facts had been resolved but that specific people had made specific errors in how they navigated those facts, and were willing to name those errors directly. What happened with Danielle was more complicated, and I think honesty requires me to resist the temptation to make it neater than it actually was. She apologized to me, approximately a week after the evening at Daniel's apartment, in a phone call that I had not been certain she would make. The apology was real in the sense that it acknowledged what she had done, used the word lie without my prompting her to use it, and didn't include any of the conditional language that often makes apologies feel like negotiations rather than genuine acknowledgments. I lied about what happened in the corridor, she said. I told everyone something that wasn't true because I was angry and embarrassed and I made a terrible decision and I'm sorry. Not sorry that I got caught. Sorry that I did it. I sat with this for a moment before responding, because I wanted my response to be honest rather than reflexively generous or reflexively cold. I believe you mean that, I said. I also need you to understand that the apology and the forgiveness are two separate things, and I'm not in a position to offer the second one right now. Maybe eventually. Not now. I understand, she said. I also need you to understand something about what the last 3 weeks have actually cost, I said. Not just me. James. You took a person who has never done anything wrong by you, who has treated you with warmth and basic human decency, and you accused him of something that could have ended our relationship, that could have defined how everyone sees him permanently, based on the fact that he politely declined something you offered in a restaurant corridor. He doesn't deserve an apology from you as an afterthought. He deserves one as the primary acknowledgement. I know, she said. Have you called him? A pause. Not yet. That needs to happen, I said. Whatever happens between you and me, that needs to happen. She called James the following day. I don't know the content of that conversation because James and I agreed that it was his conversation to have privately if he chose to have it at all, and he chose to have it privately, and afterward he told me only that it had happened and that he considered the matter, from his side, addressed. I asked him once whether he forgave her. I don't really think about it in those terms, he said. She did something harmful and she acknowledged it. Whether I forgive her is almost beside the point. The question for me is whether she's someone I want to be around going forward, and I think the honest answer is that I'll be cordial at family events and that's probably the extent of it. This felt, to me, like exactly the right calibration for a situation that the word forgiveness couldn't entirely encompass. The wedding happened 8 months after that Tuesday evening at Daniel's apartment. We had briefly discussed postponing, not because of any genuine uncertainty between James and me but because the weight of what the preceding months had contained made the idea of taking time before formalizing everything feel, for a period of perhaps 2 weeks, appealing. We decided against postponing, ultimately, for a reason that I think is worth naming directly. We didn't want the calendar of our relationship to be shaped by what Danielle had done, didn't want to hand her actions the additional consequence of rearranging our plans on top of the 3 weeks of uncertainty she'd already generated. So we got married on the date we'd always planned, in the venue we'd always chosen, with the guest list we'd assembled before any of this happened. Danielle attended. This was a decision I made after significant thought, discussing it with James at length and with my therapist and with Daniel, who was my most trusted counsel throughout this entire period. The decision to include her was not about pretending nothing had happened, and it was not about performing a family unity that didn't exist. It was about my own understanding of what I wanted the wedding to represent, a day oriented toward the life James and I were building rather than toward the damage Danielle had tried to cause. She sat toward the back of the ceremony. She came to the reception. She was courteous and quiet in a way that I recognized as effortful rather than natural, the particular effort of someone navigating a space they understand they've forfeited certain claims to. She did not give a speech. She danced briefly with Daniel and then left earlier than most other guests. I watched her leave from across the room, and what I felt, watching her go, was not anger, which surprised me. What I felt was something closer to the specific sadness of understanding that a relationship you've invested in for your entire life has been permanently altered by something neither of you can undo. Daniel gave a speech that made everyone cry, including himself, which was unusual for Daniel, who conducted himself with the same standing-up composure at public events that he apparently maintained even during Tuesday evening revelations in his living room. He said nothing in the speech about the preceding months. He spoke about me in the specific, detailed way that only someone who has known you your entire life can speak about you, with the particular stories and observations that communicate genuine, years-deep attention to who a person actually is. He spoke about James with the warmth of someone who had watched a relationship develop from its early stages and had formed his own independent assessment of its quality. Some people, he said, near the end, make the people they love more themselves. James makes Claire more herself. I've watched this for 3 years and I'm still not tired of watching it. I thought about Daniel sitting in that armchair for 3 weeks, holding his phone, trying to decide whether the right thing to do was the thing he was afraid to do. I thought about him standing up in our parents' living room and saying he needed to show everyone something, and then sitting back down because the moment had dissolved, and then making the decision 3 weeks later that the sitting was over. The most significant consequence of everything that had happened, I think, wasn't any specific resolution of the situation with Danielle or the restoration of James's reputation in our family or even the wedding itself. It was something quieter and more private, a shift in how I understood my own capacity for navigating the specific, particular difficulty of loving people who sometimes choose harm. I had spent 3 weeks in a position of genuine uncertainty, genuinely unable to be fully certain even about someone I trusted completely, and I had survived that uncertainty without it destroying either my relationship or my fundamental sense of my own judgment. This felt, in retrospect, like the most important thing the situation had taught me. Not that I had been right about James, though I had been, and not that Danielle had been capable of this, though she had been, but that I was capable of sitting inside genuine uncertainty without it consuming me. My sister and I have a relationship now that I would describe as distant but not entirely severed, maintained at a temperature that feels honest rather than performed, family events where we are present simultaneously, cordial exchanges. The specific reduced warmth of two people who have loved each other genuinely and arrived at a point where that love exists alongside an understanding that close proximity is no longer something either of us is seeking. I don't know if this will change. I think it might, over time, in the way that many things change when enough time accumulates and enough distance allows for the particular cooling of acute feeling into something more manageable. I try not to make predictions about it, because I've been wrong about Danielle before, in both directions, and I think the honest position is simply not knowing. What I know is this: I am married to someone who walked away from a corridor conversation and then spent 3 weeks watching people around him choose doubt over the record of 3 years, and who managed that period with a grace and a steadiness that I found, and find, genuinely extraordinary. I know that my brother sat with something difficult for 3 weeks because he loves his sister and also because he understood that releasing it would be irreversible, and that when he finally decided the weight was too much to keep carrying, he did it in the most responsible way available to him. I know that families contain the full range of human behavior, including the behavior of people who, when they experience rejection or loss or the particular frustration of wanting something that belongs to someone else, make choices that cause real and lasting harm. And I know that surviving those choices, without allowing them to define either the relationship that was targeted or the person you are when you come out the other side, is its own kind of work, slow and unglamorous and entirely necessary. If you've ever been in the position of not being believed by people whose belief mattered, while knowing the truth about yourself with complete certainty, I hope this story reminds you that truth has a way of surfacing, not always quickly, not always without cost, but surfacing nonetheless.